Okay, thank you very much for being here, and we are ready for the next panel. And we are going to talk about the twin side of Indo-Pacific instabilities. I am Giulia Pompili. I'm a journalist. I cover the Indo-Pacific region for a very long time. And one of the suggestions that I had in recent days from officials of the governments in the Pacific is that they were worried about the war, of course, but there is another situation very important and very clear right now. Since 2010, we focused all our attention on the Indo-Pacific region, and now our allies in the Indo-Pacific region are worried that the attention of the world will change again on Russia and on Europe. But we have a very complicated situation right now in the Indo-Pacific, and that is why we are here talking about that. And of course, the influence that the war in Ukraine will have in the same area. I would like to give the floor right now to Mr. Richard Hooker, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in DC. And you all know the rules, 7 minutes, and then we have some Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hooker.
So good afternoon, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Rome and to be with you. I've been asked to talk about India and how to strengthen NATO partnerships with respect to hybrid warfare in particular. I'd like to begin by setting the stage right up front by saying that India is not a formal NATO partner at the present time, and this does not seem to be in prospect anytime soon for reasons that I'll explain in my short presentation. And they have to do primarily with Russia. So India relies on Russia for many of its arms and their spare parts that are associated with them, and have for many, many years. And accordingly, as recently as last week at the Quad conference with the US, Australia, and Japan, India insisted that the summit communique not call out Russia by name, despite the horrific scenes that we are witnessing in Ukraine. And on the 25th of February at the UN, India abstained from condemning Russia for invading Ukraine in the Security Council. The West should not have been surprised. As IISS recently reported, India rhetorically perceives Russia as a special and privileged strategic partner, which provides critical defense technology denied to it by the West, and accounts for about 55% of its total procurement of arms and spares. Many of you will be aware that India recently began to acquire the S-400 missile defense system, despite the continued threat of US sanctions. So this is a long-standing relationship, and we'll see if the Ukraine crisis will alter it, but it has deep, deep roots. In short, it's existed for many years and withstood many shocks, and so far the Modi administration has not shown signs of moderating this stance. It's also useful to bear in mind that India has a very long history and reputation as a leader of the non-aligned world, and aspirations, given the size of its population and economy, to become something of a third pole in geopolitics. And of course, NATO contends with some of the issues having to do with democracy and democracy promotion that we see inside India. Last year, Freedom House downgraded India from democratic to partly democratic. I'm not sure. That may have happened in my own country as well. I'll have to go back and check on that in view of the erosion of press freedom and some other issues. And as I mentioned, NATO has struggled with some of that in some of the Eastern European and other countries as well. And then there is the obvious fact of geography. So while NATO has global interests and concerns, its primary focus is and must be on the North Atlantic region. And this is all the more true, of course, given the current crisis in Ukraine. So with all this in mind, let's now attempt to address the specific topic I was assigned, which was how to strengthen the relationship between NATO and India with respect to the hybrid spectrum. And a good place to start is to note that NATO and India do have common interests, above all, shared concerns about China. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine presents something of a paradox. China and Russia are engaged, as we all know, in a strategic partnership at the same time that India and Russia are. And so in times of crisis and tension, India cannot be sure which way Russia will tilt. But the odds are that Moscow sees Beijing as the more important right now. One scholar has described this by saying, India wants to eat the Chinese cake and keep the Russian one. As Russia becomes more and more an international pariah, this conundrum, I think, can only become more and more complicated for the Indian government. It is possible that the fallout from Ukraine will cause New Delhi to reevaluate its close ties with Moscow and tilt more closely to the West, but that remains far from certain at the present time. A recent article by former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Wes Mitchell called on NATO to offer full official status as a NATO partner to India and argued that the current policy of equidistancing is not a viable one. And the April 2021 visit of the Secretary General to New Delhi underscores this interest. Nevertheless, experts generally agree that as long as Pakistan enjoys formal partnership status, India's acceptance is problematic, at least for now. So the way forward will therefore be, in all likelihood, more informal, but nevertheless, I think it can be tangible in the form of meaningful cooperation, and those could take the form of joint military exercises, defense planning for maritime contingencies, technology sharing, sharing of best practices in related fields like space, cyber, nuclear policy, and to speak more directly to my homework assignment here, the information domain and hybrid war. India has a very long and unique strategic culture, and the use of information has always figured prominently. The classic Arthashastra, sort of the analogous to China's Sun Tzu, a real strategic classic, more than 2,000 years old, addresses in great detail the multiple dimensions of what today we call information or hybrid warfare. Indian strategists centuries ago wrote about concealed warfare and silent warfare as approaches lying below the threshold of conventional confrontation. Pakistani counterparts have complained for many years that India has used hybrid approaches with great effect in the many clashes that have taken place since independence. In terms of both confrontation and defense against hybrid approaches, India's experiences, I think, offer a different and a fascinating and a fresh perspective that can inform and improve NATO's understanding of this potentially decisive domain. And while formal relationships may lie in the future, there should be no objection to what Indian scholars have referred to as a pragmatic engagement between India and NATO to explore common ground. And academic exchanges like this one are one vehicle through which these explorations can take place. This is a very rich and fertile topic, I think, for discussion and for exploration. I think it's a very fascinating one, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to your interventions and your questions in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hooker. We talk about India, the biggest player in the Pacific region, but there is a place where the instability of the Indo-Pacific is most visible, and is the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is the home of some of the countries that we don't know exactly which is the position in this moment. Of course, we have Indonesia is the president of the G20 right now in this year, and there are some complexity that we still cannot understand in the area of the Central Asia and South Asia. And I will give the chair to Samina Ahmed, the project director South Asia of the International Crisis Group in Islamabad. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You know, I was asked to speak about internal conflicts in South Asia and the linkages, if any, between these conflicts and illicit trade. So let me just start off by saying that there are innumerable internal conflicts across the South Asian and indeed Central Asian region. Some that aren't known at all, such as decades-long insurgency in Balochistan. This is in Western Pakistan, bordering on Afghanistan. Some that are known somewhat, such as militancy in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in Pakistan, again bordering on Afghanistan. And some that are better known, but I think a dispute that, again, there's less and less attention on, which is the insurgency in Indian Kashmir. Now, if you look at what's driving these conflicts, it's primarily internal factors. Governance, or rather the failures of governance, very often the indiscriminate use of force as a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism tactic, the absence of the rule of law, but illegal trade, arms trade, drug trafficking, human trafficking plays a role in fueling these and other internal conflicts. I know that one of our fellow panelists is going to talk about Afghanistan in some detail, but let me just say this. If we're going to be looking at what's driving instability in the region, we cannot get away from that game changer, which is what's happening in Afghanistan today. And why do I say that? For three reasons. One, the Taliban's refusal to abide by counterterrorism obligations in the Doha Agreement. Now, quite obviously, why does that matter? It matters simply because many of the conflict actors that we're talking about in South Asia have had very close relations and have fought alongside the Taliban. This includes the Pakistani Taliban, the militants I was talking about. This includes the anti-India jihadist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And of course, it includes transnational groups such as Al-Qaeda and its associates and affiliates. So this refusal, on the Taliban part to give up those ties has another dimension as well. The Taliban military takeover has actually led other insurgent groups and jihadist and terrorist groups in the wider South Asia region to believe that Sharia, Islamic law, can be imposed through the gun. So you actually have a resurgence of many of these groups and a coming together. There's another reason why this conflict has an impact. The Taliban takeover has an impact on insurgencies and non-state actors in the wider South Asian region and across in Central Asia. This was mentioned earlier on and very briefly. The Taliban's reliance on the opium production and opium cultivation as a source of income has fueled many of these insurgent groups as well, and will continue to do so. Second, arms trade. Interestingly enough, after the Taliban takeover, sophisticated arms left behind by NATO and the US forces have fallen in the hands of insurgent groups. The Pakistani Taliban are now running around the country with night vision goggles and even more sophisticated weapons than they ever had before. Are we going to see arms trade used as sanctions bite even more by the Taliban? That's difficult to say, but what we can say is access to weaponry that was left behind is now available. Does it go all the way to militants in Kashmir? I mean, I don't say for sure we can say this is going to happen, but can we rule it out? No, we can't rule it out as well. Another interesting, I think, parallel that we can draw from what we were hearing this morning, refugees and the crisis of refugees. Quite obviously, the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world right now is in Afghanistan, and people want to leave that country. And human smugglers and traffickers are benefiting. So you have drug cartels, gun runners, human traffickers, all coming together and finding opportunities. And then, let's not forget, the transnational jihadist groups that have also found an open space. On the 5th of March, there was the worst sectarian attack in Pakistan's history. 63 people killed, more than 100 injured. That attack was claimed by the Islamic State. The attacker, a young Afghan refugee living in Pakistan, but trained in Afghanistan. The plot was conducted out of Afghanistan, conducted within Pakistan. That I think is just one example of how there's been a coming together of militants across borders in the region. The Indians are very concerned that they're going to see an uptake of conflict in Indian Kashmir, and especially because of Pakistani-based jihadist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. Let's not forget, as we talk about the conflict in Europe, Ukraine and Russia being a nuclear power. India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers. And jihadist attacks in Indian Kashmir and the Indian heartland have on several occasions almost brought India and Pakistan to the verge of war. So the dangers are acute, and the game-changing event, unfortunately, is something that I think NATO is very familiar with, which is the battlegrounds of Afghanistan and the implications from that war-torn country to the entire South Asian region. I was asked finally to talk about, can international cooperation assist in mitigating such internal conflicts? And my answer, in short, is no. If it's governance issues, international actors can only play so much of a role. But can the international community help in assisting South Asian government states to deal with other factors that fuel internal conflict? Illegal trade, terrorism, organized crime. There is where, quite obviously, capacity building efforts of law enforcement agencies can certainly assist. I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we had two major crises in Asia last year. The Afghanistan crisis, of course, and the Myanmar crisis, the putsch by the military. So I want to introduce you Peter Newman, director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, the King's College in London, and is remotely connected with us. And he will talk with us about the conflicts with a focus in Afghanistan and Myanmar. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, I had to quarantine and wasn't able to come to you in Rome, which I would have loved to. What I want to do is to briefly talk about two current conflicts in Asia, because I think they often get forgotten and they deserve more attention. First, I want to briefly touch on the big picture and then put the spotlight on those two conflicts. First, conflict in Afghanistan, and secondly, the emerging conflict or ongoing conflict, depending on how you see it, in Myanmar. The big picture is actually not quite as bad as you think. If you look at the Uppsala conflict data program, you will see that at the end of 2019, before the Taliban takeover and before the COVID pandemic, it was one country which by far was the most violent country on the planet, and that was Afghanistan, recording nearly 30,000 battle-related deaths globally. But then for a long time after that, all of the other countries that produced large numbers of fatalities were not based in Asia, or at least if you exclude the Middle East. Syria, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, Nigeria, Cameroon, all basically based in Africa, which has seen a huge expansion of conflicts, or the Middle East, but not in Asia. And if you look at the distribution within Asia, you can see again the same sort of picture reflected of the people who died in battles in 2018, 2019, until the end of 2019. By far, the vast majority of them died in the conflict in Afghanistan. And then only after a long time came other conflicts. So that shows you how important that conflict in Afghanistan has been. It also shows you that by and large, despite very serious instabilities, Asia, which hosts half of the world's population, is still, compared to other regions of the world, especially the Middle East and Africa, comparatively peaceful. But there are exceptions. Now, if you look at the map across the region, again, based on the same data from the end of 2019, you will see that there are basically, within that region, there are three hotspots, if you want. There's Afghanistan, of course, or it was Afghanistan at the end of 2019 with most conflict-related events. There are the Philippines, and there is, to some extent, Myanmar. Now, the reason I'm talking about Myanmar and Afghanistan today is because if you had a map of today, which doesn't exist yet, but if you had one, you would see a lot fewer conflict-related events and conflict-related deaths in Afghanistan, and you would see a lot more in Myanmar, with about the same number in the Philippines. So clearly in those two countries, in Afghanistan and Myanmar, the situation has changed over the past 2 years, and I would like to investigate that a little bit further. So let's first focus on Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, actually, and ironically perhaps, and paradoxically, as a result of the takeover of the Taliban, you've had a reduction in violent conflict. There's, in most provinces in Afghanistan, there's not the same level of fighting, or almost barely any fighting, compared to what happened even a year or 2 years ago. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is good. Just because there's no violent conflict doesn't necessarily mean that people are happy or the situation is resolved. In fact, the UN is saying that Afghanistan is now the country in the world that is most at risk of a severe human crisis. And there are multiple reasons for that. There have been droughts in Afghanistan last year and that are ongoing. There's the COVID pandemic, but also, of course, the Taliban have not proven to be particularly skilled at managing the country and the economy, which is not news to people who followed the Taliban for some time. It was exactly the same sort of situation the first time they were in power, from 1996 to 2001. But importantly, of course, the withdrawal of the international community has been a significant blow, also financially. International community provided up to 75% of the public spending in Afghanistan. And all of that basically disappeared almost overnight when the Taliban took over. On top of that, you have $10 billion of Afghan assets, Afghan government assets that are abroad and that have been frozen, that the Taliban government doesn't have access to, and there's ongoing civil strife and conflict. So if you add all of these factors together, you can see how this is a very, very bad situation. Now, the UN estimate that by mid-2022, 97% of the Afghan people, almost the entire population, will be below the poverty line, and 90% of health clinics will have to shut down. So this is a very severe humanitarian crisis that is often not properly reported. In fact, most of the reporters have gone after the Taliban takeover became a boring story in the Western media. But the likely consequences are very severe. Not only hunger, death, and disease, migration. A million Afghans are reported to be in the process of fleeing to neighboring countries. The growth in illicit economy, as the other speaker already referred to that, there will be an intensification of poppy production because there's very little else that generates money at the moment. And of course, there's the risk of renewed conflict. We do have a conflict between Taliban and ISIS to some extent, but this could escalate into a wider conflict. For the Western communities, this is very difficult because, as you know, there are talks going on with the Taliban. They are currently taking place in Oslo, in Norway, and some of the really difficult issues, thorny issues that prevent the international community from giving money to the Afghan government is, of course, the relationship of the Taliban with international terrorism. In fact, their willingness, capability of fighting ISIS. This continues to be complicated for the simple reason that the successful faction within Taliban, the people that are on the up within the Taliban are not necessarily the people that we are talking to either in Doha or in Oslo. They are the people like the Haqqanis, for example, who believe that they actually achieved the victory, the military victory, and they are also the ones that have traditionally close historical relationships with transnational terrorist organizations like, for example, Al-Qaeda. Another challenge is the West would like the Taliban to have a more broad-based government that includes representatives of other political factions, but also minorities, and ideally even women. And the Taliban have not been prepared to cede ground on that at all. So right now we have a situation where very little international aid goes into Afghanistan despite the humanitarian crisis. And the UN has in fact agreed to allow the Taliban to access some very small amounts of the money that has been frozen in order to buy electricity, for example, but it's not enough by any measure to solve the disaster that is likely to continue to unfold in that country. So it's very, it's a very dark picture. Now, let's briefly go to the situation in Myanmar, which is another conflict in the region, which doesn't look very good at the moment. There was, as the colleague said, there was a military coup in February 2022, basically following an election in which the party associated with the military had lost very badly. So they decided to take over the government again. This has led to renewed conflict between the military junta and the opposition, which formed a national unity government and also has a sort of armed wing, the People's Defense Forces. And over the past 12 months, we have seen conflict erupting across the country. And this is important because the International Crisis Group believes that violence is all but certain to escalate in 2022. On the one hand, this is not news because there has been a long-running civil conflict in Myanmar ever really since 1962 and the first military takeover. But this is kind of different because in the past, a lot of conflicts in Myanmar have been with so-called separatist groups, minority groups that were basically on the margins of the country, that were asking for more autonomy, and the central government denied that and repressed them brutally. But now the conflict that we're seeing increasingly is all over the country. It is also in the big cities, and all of the provinces of the country are affected, in addition to those minority areas. Just a brief word on that. Here's some basic information on Myanmar for those of you who are not so familiar with that country. A lot of the conflicts in the past, as I just said, have been between the central government, the military government, various military governments that have been in power, and minority ethnic groups, which represent about 1/3 of Myanmar's population. If you look at the map on the right here, you can see that most of the provinces that have until recently been affected by conflict were in fact the provinces bordering other countries like India in the west and Thailand on the east. And you had groups like the Karen National Liberation Army fighting in Kayin province. You had the Kachin Independence Army. There in the north of the country, you had the Shan state army fighting in Shan province. And then, of course, you had in the Rakhine, which is in the southeast of the country bordering Bangladesh, you had the Rohingya Muslims, which had been brutally repressed for decades by the government, but which were murdered in great numbers in 2016 and 2017. The difference to now, again, is that not only do you have those conflicts to some extent ongoing, you also do have conflicts in the core of the country, in the middle of the country, where you have the big cities like Mandalay or Yangon, which used to be known as Rangoon. Now, what are the likely consequences? As I said, increased conflict now in all regions of the country. The economic gains that have been made in a decade of opening are basically being erased. Already in 2021, we had a shrinking GDP, minus 18%, the biggest fall in the entire region. And poverty, which had nearly been halved between 2005 2017 during the opening of the country from 48 to 25%, is now likely again estimated to double and go back to where it used to be. You do have refugee flows. You have, again, also in Myanmar, growth in illicit economy. And also paradoxically, and this is the big picture, you have an increased reliance on China. In fact, Myanmar was weaning itself away from its reliance on China during the years of the economic opening. But now that there's increased conflict, a lot of Western investors are withdrawing from the country again and basically making the leadership, the military junta, even more reliant on China. So the picture in Myanmar is not very good at all. In conclusion, whilst it is true that Asia has been less affected by violent conflicts than other continents, especially Africa, where they have been increasing rapidly, nevertheless, there continue to be a number of crises which are likely to escalate in 2022. And I gave you two of the crises that most people are citing as particularly pertinent. Conflicts in Afghanistan, Myanmar currently receive little attention, but could be major sources of escalating conflicts. These conflicts could affect regional stability and lead to negative outcomes elsewhere, not only in the region, but via the growth in illicit economies, for example, even in the West. And despite major crises elsewhere, most prominently, of course, Ukraine, I do think that resolving these conflicts, or at least giving them a little bit of attention, should be a priority for the international community. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. We moved from Myanmar to the Strait of Malacca. And I would introduce you Raimondo Neironi, research fellow from TUI in Turin, Italy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulia. I would thank Ambassador Minuto Rizzo and the rest of crew of the NATO Defense Scholars Foundation for inviting me. I look forward to discussing this topic with other panelists. Today, I briefly would discuss about the role of international relations and in a contested Indo-Pacific of the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Singapore, which are links each other. The Straits of Malacca and Singapore are the main seaways connecting the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. And together are the shortest routes for vessel trading between the Middle East and Northeastern Asian countries. The Strait of Malacca is an important oil trade choke point, as well as the Strait of Singapore. Economically, as one of the world's two busiest straits, the Malacca Straits in 2018-2020 has hosted about 50% of the world's oil tanker traffic, 5 million barrels per day, and about 40% of the world's seaboard commerce annually. There are 4 important safety and security challenges associated with the straits. The first one is the safety of navigation, maritime security, particularly piracy, armed robbery, and the threat of terrorism in this part of the Southeast Asia, strategic interest, and finally, environmental protection of Strait of Malacca. The interested parties that play in that perilous, dangerous environment are 2. On the one hand, littoral states, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. The Batam Statement of 2005 reaffirmed the sovereign rights of these states and the primary responsibility for attaining safety and security in the Strait of Malacca and Strait of Singapore. On the other hand, there are the so-called user entities, that is, non-littoral actors that rely on straits for transit and whose interests tend to be transnational and global parallelly. This category includes private entities like the shipping industry. So let me say a few words about piracy, the most important issue in the Straits of Malacca. Non-traditional security challenges such as piracy and maritime crime comprise the primary issue affecting user and littoral states as well as shipping companies. Today, Southeast Asia continue as ASEAN to have a prominent place in global maritime piracy. There is nearly as much piracy in Southeast Asia as in the rest of the world combined, particularly Somalia, Gulf of Aden, the Straits of Hormuz, and Suez Canal. Why? Because geography compels ships to move more slowly, which contributes to congestion and make them also easier targets for terrorist and criminal attacks, armed robbery, and a range of any other criminal activities such as the illicit drug flow in Southeast Asia to the rest of the world, from Southeast Asia to the rest of the world. There are efforts to address piracy in the straits and are internal efforts, cooperation with international and regional communities, working with the like-minded organization, and the industry engagement of private-public partnership engagement. For the first internal effort, the Malacca Strait is bound jointly by Indonesia and Malaysia with the wider Malacca Straits area, also including Singaporean waters. Both the governments have responded to regional and international issues or threats about piracy, particularly from the beginning of the 21st century. These states have increased the military and strategic capabilities of their maritime agency and the frequency of maritime patrols in their own water. They have also implemented a number of multilateral and bilateral agreements with each other to halt piracy, including the 2004 trilateral Malsindo, the acronym from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore agreement to conduct coordinated patrols in the Malacca Straits. The second instrument is diplomatic tools is the Eyes in the Sky program, and the last tool is the Malacca Straits patrols. About the cooperation with the international and the regional community, it's important to underline the cooperation within three important regional talking shop, such as ASEAN Regional Forum, Maritime Forum, and ASEAN Defense Minister Plus. I would talk about the rest of the efforts during the joint conversation, and let me say a few words about the terrorism. That since the 9/11 terrorist attacks the Malacca Straits and Singapore Strait have been identified as potential targets for maritime terrorist attacks. Maritime terrorism is therefore can be considered as a transnational issue affecting not only Southeast Asian states but also the rest of Asia, for example, China. A truly effective defense against it would require a high level of cooperation between states and less intransigence on the concept of sovereignty. Environmental protection, an important and last point that I would like to talk about. The littoral states should back cooperation with the NGOs and the international shipping industry over environmental protection, but there are some problems, some issues that impede cooperation in Southeast Asia. The three littoral states consider that sovereignty on the waters must be respected and that financial burden should be shared between the three littoral states. Last, as for NGOs' perspective, the marine environment should be preserved at all times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Neironi. I start with a round of questions, and then you can prepare yours, and we have a session of Q&A from that microphone. My first question, I use the same order. About India, Dr. Hooker, last year we had a lot of, several new alliance. We had Quad, and India was engaged in a conversation with Japan, the US, and Australia. But then, like 1 week later, we had the AUKUS between the UK, US, and Australia. So, what is exactly that India can think about that? Because it's like, okay, the Quad is no more about defense, but it's about security, and what kind of conversation should I have with the Western alliance, and if can exist an alliance only on the basis of being anti-China?
Right. I think it can be useful to try to look at this question through Indian eyes. So India very soon is going to be the most populated nation on the planet. It is for sure a great power on the way to being perhaps a superpower, nuclear power. And they have a long, long tradition of being a non-aligned actor and in a way a balancer. So to the extent that Indian interests may align with the interests of NATO or of the West or of other partners in the region, then I think there's ground for cooperation. But I think we should not be too eager to see this formalized until a direct threat materializes that India feels like it can't manage. And I don't think that we're there right now. So for example, we've seen increased maritime cooperation with U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and with other partners in the region, but mostly it's been focused on the Indian Ocean and not on the South China Sea and so on and so on. Should a live military threat materialize, let's say in the next 10 or 20 years, or an unforeseen clash with China on some kind of scale, then I think you'll see the Indian leadership perhaps reevaluate the status that has been in place for so long. But until that happens, I think we ought not to expect too much. More cooperation, more discussion, more informal arrangements, but nothing too formal for now.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Dr. Ahmed. You talk about the influence of Pakistan in Afghanistan, but it can be an issue for the relations between Pakistan and China. Is there any competition on who is the most important player in Afghanistan?
I don't think the Chinese want to engage that deeply in Afghanistan for a simple reason. They know how complicated the situation is. They know their opportunities, but they also know their major constraints. And there's a good reason for Chinese hesitancy in going beyond where they are in the relationship. They have not recognized the Taliban government, and they are not likely to recognize it until and unless they see Taliban action against what they see as their primary threat, which is Islamic or Islamist groups that are targeting, or supposedly in Chinese perceptions being targeting, China in Turkmenistan, eastern Turkmenistan. So until they see action taken against what they perceive as their main security threat, they're not going to move further. The second reason is the Chinese are bit badly in the past. They invested a huge amount of money, assuming that there would be returns in extractive industries. Insecurity in Afghanistan meant that nothing came out of it, and they're not going to invest more till they see those returns. And the final reason, their closest relationship is with Pakistan, which matters a whole lot more than Afghanistan for the Chinese.
Thank you so much. Dr. Newman, how much the chaos in Myanmar can affect and can be some contagion on the area? You said the conflicts are not so, the conflicts in Asia are not so, have not an impact so big like in Europe, but do you think that the situation in Myanmar, that is very complex, very complicated, can have some kind of effect in other area, in Asia, of course?
Yes, I do think so. I think there will be an effect, first of all, in terms of refugees. We're seeing that already And it's estimated that around 1 million people could make their way now this year into neighboring countries. And you have an effect in terms of the growth of illicit economies. And Myanmar, I mean, it's sometimes a little bit, misleading to describe the groups that I mentioned in my presentation purely as insurgent groups. First of all, they are not quite as coherent as their names suggest, but also many of them are deeply invested in illicit trade. There are, in fact, some scholars that essentially describe them as armed organized crime groups. And I do think that strengthening of the conflict will provide them with even more opportunities to engage in illicit economies, not only within Myanmar, but also affecting countries across the region.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dr. Naironi, we talk a lot about the war game in Asia Pacific and the freedom of navigation operations led by the US, but from all the alliance, and we need to have a free Southeast Asia, South China Sea, in order to get connected to Asia for the market or for the business. But do you think that the military exercise from the Western alliance, but also the recent one between China and Russia can be another issue of instability?
It's a good question. It's very difficult to reply in a few minutes, but I think that China at this moment seems to be encircled by the Western agreements, such as the AUKUS, for example. We know that Australia is the main strategic partner of the United States, but at the same time, China is the main trade partner of Australia. So this is very important to explain that Western allies in the region, such as Australia, must consider these important strategic and economic aspects to create, to find a common ground on a contested Indo-Pacific. As for the recent Chinese-Russian military operation in South China Sea, it's a signal. It's a signal to ASEAN particularly. Why? Because ASEAN is a loose and weak organization in Southeast Asia. It's the most important organization, regional association in Southeast Asia, but it seems to be very weak because it is not able to take a part to
a real position
to United States and Western countries and China in particular. The South China Sea, it's very, it's a risky event in a puzzle, an Asian puzzle. But in my opinion, it's very difficult to forecast a common shared solution about the contested island in that part of Asia.
Yes, that's why we have international arbitrations, but if we don't recognize it, it's difficult. We have a question from our virtual audience. Do you think that China represents a risk for the international order? as a regional player or maybe global player, could India balance Chinese influence? This is maybe for Dr. Hooker.
I think it's clear that the U.S. government, anyway, right now sees China as the #1 national security and international security challenge, for sure. Although Ukraine is crowding the front page, I think that's still the case, and for good reason. So if you compare Chinese military activity of 10 and 20 years ago, or the state of its military to today, you've seen a dramatic change. Really tough pressure on Taiwan, the militarization of artificial islands in the East and South China Seas, a big expansion in naval power, and then its land-based missiles force, which is really formidable. Not the case that China is a sort of a blue water maritime peer yet, although our own admirals sometimes, I think, play that up a bit for their own reasons, but not yet. But should this trend continue, and should China undertake actual military action in the Indo-Pacific region, then as I said a moment ago, I think you can expect Indian strategists and the Indian government to reorient. Right now, they're trying to navigate between non-aligned status, but to hedge their bets with closer cooperation with other like-minded partners. And depending upon Chinese behavior, I think you're going to see movement in that area. We hope that there's no intention to take advantage of the current situation in Asia Pacific, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. Is there any question from the audience? Please, can you? Thank you. I beg you to be short in your questions and.
Well, I would like to have more space from the audience rather than the moderator asking 5 or 6 questions.
I'm sorry.
Well, my name is Vesel Memedi. I'm an ambassador of North Macedonia to Italy. I have a short question. It is related to this session and to the previous session. Do you believe that the dissemination of the knowledge and research that you have done, or the previous session, and so many of scholarly work that you have done, by disseminating that in a simplistic way to the ordinary citizens, can be an obstacle to all these criminal groups and terrorist groups, like the example of Zelensky is doing, that he has united the entire nation by using his PR, that he's really good, and with bare hands, Ukrainian people are fighting Russian troops. So do you believe this knowledge, this research that you have done, if you simplify it and disseminate to common people, to ordinary citizens, do you think that is a powerful, attractive, gravitational force to help obstruct or be an obstacle to these groups, be that criminal or terrorist groups? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that this is the journalist's job to translate the hostix and complicated issue that the analyst came out with studies, and then is our job to make them more easy for common people. But someone of you wants to have a comment and reply to the ambassador.
It's not, I think, it was a useful point that you made, which is how do you take your recommendations that come out of your analysis and take them across to an audience who are the real stakeholders in some ways, in more than one way. It's not just policymakers who are the stakeholders. It's citizens who are the stakeholders. And I do think that governments tend to forget. They address the elite and they don't address their own citizens. The threat of extremism, terrorism, whatever definition you want to use for it, it hits citizens the most. Government functionaries have a degree of protection. And when citizens think that the state doesn't even let them know the significance of the threat that they're facing, they lose trust in the state. So it's a valid point that you make.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Please.
I had a question about India and its role in Central Asia, and how likely is it for India to abandon its traditional role as non-aligned and perhaps veer towards a more Western alliance and to counteract and represent counterbalance to China's rise and influence in the Central Asian region? Thank you.
A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, perhaps I didn't stress in my presentation enough that the central and even existential challenge for India in terms of its national security is the ongoing situation with Pakistan, with Kashmir, but with Pakistan more broadly. This has been the case for half a century or more. It will continue to be the case for a long time to come. They're both nuclear powers, and so I think that's got to be number one. India, not so transparent to the rest of the world, also deals with many internal challenges, having to do with its many languages and nationalities and difficult history and all of that. So although China is up there on the list of national security challenges, it may not be seen right now as the most existential one. And to see India move from its traditional posture of being a non-aligned leader of the non-aligned world, you would have to see, I think, a pretty significant upgrading in the perception of threat from China to do that. And I think China is more focused right now on the East and South China Sea, on Taiwan, on its competition with the United States, than it is with military adventures with India. But get back with me in 5 or 10 years and we'll see where we are. That's how I see it right now.
Questions? Other questions? I think that we can have the Pakistani point of view of this, because it's interesting to know, it's interesting to analyze how much effectively India is focusing on China, but traditionally the main competition has always been with Pakistan. And that's affected in some ways also the Afghanistan situation and the complexity of the region.
Well, India would want to disengage from Pakistan.
Sure.
Because it drags India down to what it sees as a competition with a much smaller country, as opposed to what India perceives its own image, which is as a global power. But these are the two terrible twins. They feed off each other's, I think, insecurities. To some extent, India has good reason to be concerned. You know, the number of jihadist attacks that have taken place, which have been traced back to Pakistan. But on the other hand, when it comes to that main so-called dispute, Kashmir, as I said very briefly in my presentation, it's got nothing to do with Pakistan, it's got everything to do with governance. So until and unless India comes to terms with its own perceptions of greatness and its own lack of the ability to govern, it's going to be tied in that struggle with this terrible twin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any question from the virtual audience to Dr. Newman? How do you evaluate the terrorism threat in China, and how do you see Beijing posture toward Uyghurs? Dr. Newman.
Well, it's an excellent question. In fact, I talked about that during the first Game Changers conference, where I gave a presentation on the Xinjiang conflict. And it seems like there isn't much of a conflict anymore right now. but that's partly because the Chinese government has so brutally repressed it. Let's not forget that they basically imposed a very harsh form of martial law that up to an estimated 1 million people have been put into re-education or labor camps, which the Chinese government doesn't allow anyone to go to. And that effectively Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province have been forbidden to exercise the right to exercise their religion. So under these conditions, it's very difficult to see how there could be a conflict. But of course, as anyone who knows, who studies terrorism, understands that unless the Chinese government keeps up this situation for eternity, at some point, the situation that is existing right now will come back to haunt the Chinese government, because the grievances that are being created right now amongst Uyghurs in China are so severe that I can imagine that at some point in the future there will be a resurgence again of separatist sentiment and also of terrorist attacks. So I do think right now there isn't much terrorism per se, because it has been repressed so severely. Even though there may be a little bit, we don't get a lot of good information out of China. But I think certainly the consequences of what the Chinese government has been doing over the past 2 or 3 years will follow China for many years to come.
Thank you. Raise your hands if you want to make some question. I go on. We have 5 minutes left. I have a question for all of you. How much the pandemic affected the instability of Indo-Pacific? Because it's strange. We saw China be so powerful in the influence with the Chinese vaccine, and effectively they distribute vaccines for all the countries, and even the South Pacific little tiny islands, and we did not with COVAX and the United Nations, not in time. So I don't know if someone of you wants to. The pandemic was a very good opportunity for the Western Alliance to give some more influence. It's not the diplomatic influence that we are talking about, like China used this kind of tools to rise its influence, but still we concentrate only on us and to keep us safe, and the Indo-Pacific region has a very, very long troubles, and I think about India and Pakistan, and what do you think? We miss an opportunity?
Yes, the pandemics could be a great event to reconsider strategic alliances in the Pacific, for example. Let me say the importance of potential role of India to connect and to secure the Straits of Malacca and Straits of Singapore through the the utilization of Indian Navy in the Straits, for example. Today, they occur as specific military exercises financing and supporting by the United States to the Philippines, Malaysia, or Singapore. In my opinion, India could be a leading role to mediate within ASEAN between different positions on the strategic implication of Southeast Asia country, for example, in my opinion. What about the role of the United States in the Indo-Pacific? That's a good question. The US plays today a leading role in the Indo-Pacific, along with the strategic allies, just such as the Philippines, And on the other hand, even the European Union have shaped a comprehensive strategy for the Indo-Pacific, even if France and the Netherlands and the UK have effectively approved in their respective parliaments are strategic for the Indo-Pacific countries. So maybe the role of India has been downplayed by the United States and other countries, specifically Southeast Asian nations.
Can I say something?
Yes, that's
yeah. Well, I mean, in addition to the sort of geopolitical issues highlighted by my colleague, I think I would definitely agree that it's made a difference. The pandemic has made a big difference to instability in the region. I would say that the pandemic has been an instability amplifier in the sense that when countries that were already fragile or that had already experienced sort of conflict to some extent, if they were additionally hit by the pandemic, it really made the consequences worse. And you could clearly see that in the case of Afghanistan, but also in the case of Myanmar. The pandemic, the situation that has resulted from that, has certainly made these conflicts more severe, even though the pandemic itself didn't cause these conflicts. These conflicts were caused by humans, but the pandemic has aggravated the situation that we're seeing across the continent.
Thank you very much. I think the time is up. We have one last question from the online virtual audience. Maritime terrorism is one of the most pressing issues in the Pacific. Do you see a role for the US and the EU? In fact, there is a role for both in anti-piracy, not totally.
A huge percentage of global maritime trade passes through the Straits of Malacca. And when it becomes a real problem for the United States is going to do something about it. Anywhere in the global commons on the oceans of the world, if it's seen as something that can be managed in conjunction with other partners that are perhaps closer to that part of the world, that's going to be the preferred point of view. But where it begins to touch on the vital interests of the United States, which really are its economic standard of living and its access to trade and those sorts of things, you can absolutely expect the U.S. as a maritime power to become more and more and more involved. The EU, perhaps not so much. At least in the military domain.
Do you want to add something?
Okay, about the U.S. role?
The EU anti-piracy role. But we have a lot of East Asian actors in the Hormuz Strait, so...
Yes. The EU funded military and strategic operation in the Straits of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca, but this implication, this commitment is very weak today. So the US for now and China play leading roles for securing the Indo-Pacific.
I have some doubts about China and security in the same sentence, but...
No, it's same sentence, yeah.
I'm sorry. Well, thank you so much to all. Thank you so much to our host, Dr. Newman from London, and see you next year. Thank you, bye-bye. Now, in the next panel.
To control.